Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Perspective Philosophy, where we try to better our perceptions of the world through philosophical discussion. Today, I will be reviewing the Jordan Peterson and Slavoj Zizek, isn't it? Slavoj Zizek. I think it was a really great debate. I think that it was much more interesting than I thought it was going to be, primarily because they didn't focus mostly on the differences between communism and capitalism and instead focused on happiness. And that's something that I'm very much interested in, considering ethics, and especially with me interest in the ancient Greeks and particularly Aristotle. So to begin, I think a good way to structure this would be to take it step by step through the debate as it was formatted. So the first place to start would be Peterson's opening statement, then Zizek's opening statement, and then their replies. So it is my hope with this video that I'll give you some genuine insight into some of the philosophical critique that can be laid on both parties and the broader philosophical ramifications of what they're saying. They really go quickly through the points, especially Zizek. He says a lot very fast without really expanding on what he said. Not that what he said isn't great, but rather that it can get you a bit lost off. So I want to try and make sure that everyone's up to speed, everyone knows where the debate's going, and maybe some potential criticisms that can be levied on both sides. So my first issue with Peterson's opening statement is that it reads a manifesto as something more than a manifesto. A manifesto isn't something that should be looked at as its own justification. Manifestos really just outline the position, they don't provide the sufficient reason for the position. That you can find in Marx's broader work. So I would suggest reading Capital or, the economic manuscripts and so on for a broader justification of Marx's position of why he is calling for revolution, which is what the Communist Manifesto really is, a call for revolution. So Peterson breaks down his position into 10 axioms, which he thinks that Marx slips in as unjustified, begging the question statements that just have no real weight behind them. The first axiom that he really goes to critique was this idea of history as a class struggle, the idea of reading history as a class struggle, which is within the Communist Manifesto. The proletariat are seeking equality, essentially. So this is something that Marx somewhat took from Hegel, this idea that history itself is a movement towards a greater goal. Hegel argued, though, that it was the development of subjectivity and not necessarily one group against another. That being said, Peterson levies the claim that hierarchies, this tension of hierarchies, is the problem that's coming up in Marx's work, and that this isn't a historical problem, but more of a biological problem, and that's the issue that he has with it. And he says that rather than looking at it as if it is a problem with capitalism, we should look at it as a problem with human nature, or, nature as a whole, where species seek to hierarchize in a winner-take-all scenario. I'm not convinced by this criticism. I think that it's unjustified. If you look towards something like Paulo Vernal's natural historical diagrams, you'll see that what we consider human nature, for example, typically is a historical understanding or a historical comparison between two societies, typically of the same culture a lot of the time anyway. So we tend to see cultural overlap, and what we're really doing is showing that humans were like this at one point and now they're like this. It doesn't necessarily show any fundamental ties towards a hierarchical goal. I think Peterson's claim that there is a hierarchical problem regardless of whether capitalism would exist does seem to make sense, though. It seems to point out that there is perhaps an ideological problem with individuals and how we're willing to structure ourselves and our lives and our social, spheres, because he does even point out that there are hierarchies outside of capital investment, that we can, hierarchize on looks, or we can hierarchize on, well, pretty much everything, actually. We do hierarchize a lot. We seek, expertise and authority over each other. And that's something in which power, I think, is fundamentally linked to not necessarily a human nature, but in a broad sense, but certainly within who we are at this moment in time. I would, however, like to show that the distribution of wealth in capitalism holds greater significance to the positions in which individuals take within a power structure. So power becomes more fundamentally diverse, yet still in a very class system in which there is a a ruling class and then an oppressed class beneath that, it seems, like namely working class, upper class kind of dynamics. And within that, the individual is placed at a disadvantage that they weren't in the times of feudal times, not because they're at a greater power disadvantage, because if anything, they probably have more power. The issue is that they are coerced into labor. They are no longer physically bound to it. And so revolution becomes harder and harder because they are ideologically constrained. And I think this is a point in which Zizek is going to get at. So another point that Peterson makes that I fundamentally disagree with is this idea that management does not seek to exploit the worker because that would not make capitalist sense. It wouldn't make enough money. Exploiting the worker wouldn't benefit you because you wouldn't get the maximum amount of profit out of them.
First of all, you're a bloody fool to exploit your workers, because even if you're greedy as sin, because you're not going to extract the maximum amount of labor out of them by doing that. And the notion that you're adding no productive value as a manager rather than a capitalist it's absolutely absurd.
This idea that the manager versus, the king, for example, is very different, that the exploitation doesn't seek to take absolute advantage of the worker because they need the worker themselves. They need a good relationship with the worker. I see this as false. Management works to exploit individuals as best as they can. It's a way to use people as a means to an end. A manager is given the end with whatever job role they are working in, So, for example, a corporation will provide a manager with a set target, and then the manager will use the employees beneath him or her to reach this target in any way they can by manipulating those employees, by changing the social dynamics in order to try and hit the target, or at least to try and justify their position towards the corporation so that they can go, we hit the target and it's all because of me. Which I think is fundamentally untrue as well. I have very great doubt in the managerial sciences. I don't think they're a science. The social sciences as a whole, their predictive power is non-existent. Alistair McIntyre shows this really well when he says, the manager treats ends as a given as outside his scope. His concern is with technique, with the effectiveness in transforming raw materials into final products, unskilled labour into skilled labour, investment into profits. McIntyre goes on to say that managers are justified through their expertise, and their expertise is essentially their ability to manipulate people to achieve this end goal. But to do this, they would need some sort of predictive capabilities upon human behaviour. But no such predictive capabilities exist. There is nothing that can predict how people will actually behave in any given scenario. All we have is a variation of sociological statistics. We don't actually know how people will react to various stimuli. We make assumptions. And for that to say that would justify power, I mean, if we're talking about a CEO who's apparently justifying earning far more than all the employees who are committing the labor that actually creates the products the company sells or the service the company sells, well then he better be damn good at making predictions upon human behaviors. Economics seems to be more willing to recognize its limited predictive abilities, probably because of Adam Smith and this idea of the invisible hand and genuinely the overall failures that economists make from time to time. And the stakes that are involved. I think they don't want to express that they can predict the future, because if they did try to say that, then they would be laughed at. I think overall, all of the social sciences lack predictive power. We cannot predict human behavior. In terms of the manager, if the manager had any real predictive power over given individuals, we would expect, as Alistair McIntyre says, to see law-like generalizations like we do in sciences. We like to say that, we can predict the movement of bodies through space-time, because we have Newtonian physics. At least like at a macroscopic level, we can understand that the movement of, Saturn, Jupiter, Earth can be predicted by Newton's laws of motion. And these are law-like generalizations. Now, not to say that they always are acting upon these bodies in every single manner, but rather that there are only a certain number of given and documented exceptions which still fit in the law. So this is a level of predictive generalization which allows you to make grandiose predictions based upon evidence you can obtain and provide, like empirical data. You can't do this with individuals' behaviors. You can only make assertions that people will behave one way or another based upon statistics which tell us how things are, not necessarily how things are going to be. And Alistair McIntyre does show that there is a level of unpredictability within individuals, pointing towards conceptualization. We can't predict what concepts will form and how people will react to them. And he also goes further into this, but you can read that in your own time. That is in After Virtue. Alistair McIntyre really does show that these law-like generalizations do not occur in the social sciences when he says, in other words, the logical form of these generalizations, or lack of it, turns out to be rooted in the form, or lack of it, of human life. We should not be surprised or disappointed that the generalizations and maxims of the best social sciences share characteristics of the predecessors, the proverbs of folk societies, the generalizations of jurists, the maxims of Machiavelli, and indeed to Machiavelli that is where we now return. What this argument shows is that Fortuna is eliminable. Fortuna for Machiavelli was this notion of this bitch goddess of luck who kind of is ineliminable from human life. We can't predict human actions, and Machiavelli was all about that because it was all about power and control. So he even argues that you just can't predict human behavior. It's just unpredictable. Something that I agree with. I don't think that we could predict human behavior. McIntyre even points out if we did have an ability to predict human behavior, then we would also have to have a machine that would predict the predictions of the machine that was predicting human behavior. And I think he's shown that it's a bit of an infinite regress where there would be a constant predictive process going on. So if you look at game theory, the idea of predicting an opponent's behavior would be that I know how you're thinking about how I'm thinking about your thinking, and it keeps going back. So what I think a good example of this is a game of chess. When you go to move, I know that you've only got a certain amount of possible moves, but that you're basing your moves off my next move. So when I'm thinking about my next move, I'm thinking about you thinking about my move, thinking about your move, thinking about my move, and we're so many steps ahead of where we actually are on the board. But because of that, there's a level of predictable uncertainty. We don't know how many steps ahead each party is taking and what move we're actually going to take in each scenario. So the uncertainty builds. And that's why, we don't have really boring games of chess. Further, I think what McIntyre shows as well is that managers are really self-justifying, that their expertise is non-existent, but instead is used to justify their presence within corporations as, for example, a managerial leadership role that can claim more of the product of the individual's labour. As the manager, I'm entitled to a greater amount of profit than you because you're my subordinate and I have expertise and skills that you don't. This idea of skilled labour, even though it's not skilled, the expertise doesn't exist, it's a lie. And I think he says this really well when he says, the effects of 18th century prophecy have been to produce not scientifically managed social control, but a skillful dramatic imitation of such control. It is historic success which gives power and authority in our culture. The most effective bureaucrat is the best actor. So to bring this back to Peterson's claim, I really do think that managers are not necessarily worthless. I don't think managers are worthless. I mean, they seem to be able to, for example, organize human behavior, but I don't think that entitles them to more money and more control over the corporation as a whole. I think that the job that they do is useful, but not a predictive power. So the next point he makes is about group identity and this idea of bourgeoisie versus proletariat. This is actually something I think he's right about. There is this unfortunate oversimplification of the idea of the working class versus the upper class, which I don't think holds out. However, I do think Marx has a point in the class divide in regards to an ideological position in which individuals hold. Marx is really showing that the individual is oppressed not necessarily by the oppressor, but by themselves, by their alienation from what they're doing on a day-to-day basis, which is linked to the institutions of our society. He's pointing out there is a class divide there. How that class divide actually functions in this idea of bourgeoisie versus proletariat is incredibly vague, but I think it's important to recognize that there is a division there in the first place. So I do think that it's worth at least considering that although basic it may be, this bourgeoisie-proletariat divide does hold some merit. So the next issue Peterson has with Karl Marx's position is that this idea of the proletariat being more productive if they seized control. Why would we become a hyper-productive society? Well, I think he actually is right here. We wouldn't necessarily become more productive. I don't think there's anything in this revolutionary stance that would force an increase of productivity. But I do think the removal of alienation from the worker and the workplace, for example, the means of production and the product of their labor, would provide some encouragement to work. And it would also free up time for more creative endeavors, more which produce new markets, new market opportunities, and new potential for labor. Now, I think that it's important to recognize this, because once we move towards newer, higher versions of labor, where we can free ourselves from the basic needs we have, and we can venture into new modes of labor, new markets, then what we have then is an opportunity for employment. And we have an opportunity to see people being more productive in their own time, in their spare time, and not coming home, flipping on the TV and sitting, being bored. So what we'd see is a greater amount of productivity and production in a given individual's life. And I think less psychological distress from being productive as well, which I think is vital for the stability of any society. The greater the stress on the populace, the greater the overall social instability there will be. So the last critique of Peterson's position I'm going to give is his point on capitalism providing for the poorest the fastest. I actually think this is a really good point, and it's probably one of the strongest positions for free market capitalism. This idea that the individuals in poorest countries will escape poverty the fastest way possible if a free market is implemented in that environment. So it seems to me to be a bit romanticized, this idea that capitalism will free the poorest from being poor, at least in absolute poverty. The reason I'm going to say that is, one, if you look at the richest countries in the world, for example, like America, there is a considerable amount of homelessness and poverty even in that state, even though that individuals have a state which is incredibly wealthy. Wealth simply is not being distributed properly so that these people cannot actually have the means of their own survival. This, I think, is a problem of capitalism itself, providing the necessary social fabric of our society. I would like to point out that the economies that he's pointing to are using traditional capitalist mechanisms. This is typically manufacturing. This isn't service-based sectors like the UK or the USA, in which corporations we see today see labour not only as an unnecessary expense, but something that can be done away with through the actual means in which they produce profit. Profit now is much more closely related to a stock market price, a stock price, virtual currency, than anything physical. We don't actually have to produce anything. There is no workers that necessarily need to be involved within the process to some degree. So this leads to less employment, and also there is less productivity when individuals are at work, because our economies are far more based upon the movement of virtual currency than the movement of actual consumerism. This leads to individuals having less money because they're actually being not only paid less, but there's less jobs within sectors for them to actually then afford their ways of living. I don't see it as being long until automation also reduces the demand for labour and causing more problems in our society. And I think that we're going to have to implement some sort of scheme in which individuals are given a wage to survive on. One of the issues that we have is this mass amount of debt in our society. And unless that's paid off, then we will go into recession, but it never gets paid off because we bail out the banks rather than the debtors, and so the debt only accumulates and the banks constantly buy their own stocks to levy their position on the stock market. So we're given this scenario where capitalism's apparently going to free the most poor from, being poor, but overall we're not seeing an increase in wages in these developed countries, in these developed nations. So capitalism might free the absolutely most poor at times, but it won't be long until the economy changes shape and becomes a more consumerist, service-based economy anyway. You can see this happening in China. China's becoming more of a consumerist, service-based economy, and it will export its production to Africa. And you'll see an increase and a boom in African economies, and China's economy will stabilize, or will actually increase in the service-based, but the average wage for the individual may fall. It's something that I'm interested in monitoring for the future anyway. Another point that I think could be levied would be that perhaps in something more similar to anarcho-socialism as proposed by Noam Chomsky, the idea of syndicates in which individual workers owned the means of production and were participants in the production of their own product which they themselves owned, this would really help solve some of the issues because these service-based sectors would now be under the control of the general population who actually work for them. This would mean that the individual was no longer alienated from those mass amounts of profits unnecessarily accumulated to such high levels and alienated from their employment, from the workforce. So this brings me to the end of Peterson's opening statement. I think that his position was pretty strong. I think he made some really valuable points, but that he focused too much on capitalism versus communism, this idea that capitalism is a better system, when it's, bridged on happiness. Will it bring us happiness? And he didn't really touch too much on happiness, at least not there. But he did recognize that he thought it was going to be more capitalism versus communism, so that's fair enough. Now to move on to Zizek's opening statement. Zizek's opening statement was an absolute beast. I mean, we are talking about raising a lot in one single go, and it was very hard to critique. At least I found it hard to critique as a Hegelian, agreeing with most of his points. So it's something that I did very much enjoy as well, though. He did raise some very interesting points about ideology. So Zizek really focuses his opening statement on this connection between happiness and ideology, and then ideology and capitalism or power structures as a whole. And so argues for a communist revolution from the point that capitalism will create an ideology which will make us unhappy. He kind of says we shouldn't aim for happiness, but we'll get on to that in a minute. So Zizek points out that seeking happiness seems to be ineffective, that when we seek happiness, we don't necessarily achieve it, and instead we're better off seeking meaning, and that when we seek a meaningful life, we're more likely to achieve happiness overall, something that I agree with, but that can be quite difficult in a secular society, in a society in which our moral duties are not given to us. And he even says himself that we hold this duty towards our duties, in which we now have the responsibility to work out which duty we need to fulfill, and that we can no longer just point towards an institution as its own justification, and that brings increased hardship for the contemporary individual. He then points out that because we have this responsibility towards ourselves, and the duties we hold, that a return to traditional values without any justification are really just postmodern fakes, as he calls it. He gives the example of Donald Trump as the perfect postmodern president, arguing that Donald Trump doesn't actually represent any of the conservative traditional values that he apparently says he does, but instead is a fake, is a fraud, and is used to manipulate the population to gain votes. Something which I think speaks for itself, how many traditional conservative values are coming through Donald Trump's legislation. So he then moves on this point of having the responsibility to choose our actions to live a meaningful life, and says that religion itself will not provide an answer because religion can change our behaviors to make us do the things that will make us unhappy, that it can make us act in a spirit of envy, in jealousy, in a way that turns us back in on ourselves. And I think this is a point which comes from Nietzsche. There can be this confliction between what you actually want to do and those values you hold and what religion tells you to do, in which religion can turn you back in on yourself as a hostile force. So the point about religion being a corrupting influence upon the individual, he says best when he says,
conservative thinkers claim that the origin of our crisis is the loss of our reliance on some transcendent divinity or higher value. If we are left to ourselves, if everything is historically conditioned and relative, then there is nothing preventing us to indulge in our lowest tendencies. But is this really the lesson to be learned from mob killing, looting, and burning on behalf of religion? It is often claimed that, true or not, religion makes some otherwise bad people do good things. From today's experience, I think we should rather stick to Steve Weinberg's claim that while without religion, good people would have been doing good things and bad people bad things, only something like religion can make good people do bad things. Lesson of today's terrorism is that if there is a God, then everything, even blowing up hundreds of innocent bystanders, is permitted to those who claim to act directly on behalf of God. The same goes also for godless Stalinist communists. They are the ultimate proof of it. Everything was permitted to them since they perceived themselves as direct instrument of their divinity.
I really like the point that religion can be a negative force upon the individual, but really he's talking about ideology as a whole, which is what he brings it into. This idea that certain institutions embody ideological stances, that there is ideology floating around us essentially wherever we go, related to the power structures in the society in which we live. And a lot of them can be negative. Of course, I would argue as a moral objectivist, a lot of them can be positive. And I think necessarily he wouldn't disagree, but rather that the institutions that we would try and progress morality have been corrupted by power. He really forwards this point upon ideology when he gets into this expression of Nazis having a pathological need to hate Jews. Like, it wasn't that Jews had actually done anything. There was social tension that was not being explained within the ideology in which they lived, and instead they placed an outside enemy in order to resolve this misunderstanding in which the individual had. Because if the individual recognized that there was a social issue in which they had to deal with, they would have to change their ideology. But they didn't want to change their ideology. They didn't want to think that they as Germans were not functioning harmoniously in the way that they thought they would, and instead sought that outside enemy to explain away all of the problems. Well, this has happened throughout all of human history. This is something certainly that isn't necessarily a capitalist problem, but is related to power as a whole. And capitalism is definitely one of the most powerful systems where we can see power permeating the lives of every individual in a variety of different ways. And I think that is why he's making this criticism of capitalism per se. So this would be Marx's critique of Hegel. Hegel argued that social institutions were the product of individuals forming a conception of right, that we kind of come together and we create notions and understandings which we progress our understandings of the world. This is in an investigation that is progressing throughout history in which we are overcoming social societal dilemma which allow for the expression of subjectivity. Now, it's a really beautiful argument. However, Marx just flips it on its head and he says, yeah, well, what about if people aren't creating institutions and instead institutions are creating people?